Hi, I'm Ikea, and for today's video I want to ramble on for a bit about it not being the build dummy, as quite often I see the tendency of people asking for builds, but also talking about builds, to kind of overemphasize what a build does, or even go the other way and kind of underemphasize what a build is capable of. And both are actually, I feel, tendencies that should be kind of pushed back against. As yeah, it isn't just the build, the content and the player matters quite a bit. Having the right toolbox for that build or a specific build is actually much more important, I feel, than just knowing about the build, about the build's existence, as some builds definitely require a toolbox kind of to make them work. And yeah, this is definitely one of these old man yells at sky kind of videos, but in it as well, I'm going to kind of lay out how I look at builds, and I hope that at least will be interesting for everybody. And we'll also kind of go over some of the tendencies that I quite often see within the community of over-attributing or under-attributing to builds, and why I think that's just a bad way of looking at things. Then as well, I kind of want to address one other thing that quite often comes up of like, what build should I run for this weapon? Which are quite often, especially when it comes to weapons, not that important what build is underneath it. A weapon quite often is just that, a weapon. The build will care sometimes about what weapon is attached to it, but oftentimes not even really. So yeah, let's go get into it. And to kind of, lay out what I mean, it not being the build dummy, is that the build by itself, of course, does nothing. The build is being piloted by someone and in certain context. Both of those contexts matter quite a bit. Because, for instance, a Headhunter's Fury or a high-end Regulus setup in the hands of a speedrunner can, of course, be very powerful. But that doesn't make it so that the build is setting world records. It's the combination of that content with that player or that subset of players, and then that build. Because that relies on a lot of other things. For instance, the toolbox that a player that has gone that in-depth that they're speedrunning the game will have. And we'll kind of go into what I even further mean with toolbox in a future video where we go about building your own toolbox. But a toolbox is basically, to me, all of the kind of little tricks that you have, even some of the bigger ones. And this also, for instance, includes, and I'll link to that in the description here as well, to, for instance, the Improving Yourself series, where we kind of talk about positioning, game knowledge, builds knowledge, triage, and such, and just plain old aim and how to, improving your aim. All of those things are, for instance, things in the toolbox, but also the things in the toolbox can be very specific. Like, for instance, the last video about the health gate. Once you kind of understand that will help out quite a bit with, for instance, how to stay upright. Once you understand the health gate a little bit better, that can be a very important tool. But same as well, for instance, in understanding how to quickly use foam, for instance, or where shields can be useful, and how to, for instance, kind of corner, peek, and pie a room, basically. All of those things are kind of small tools that kind of go into a bigger toolbox that you'll basically have with you. Part of that toolbox as well, then game knowledge as an important one. That is actually one of the important things that will shift from how players will play over time. Starting out, you'll start playing reactively. You'll see something spawns over there, you'll start shooting at it. Playing reactively, a lot of builds can't actually work well in that kind of setup. One of the core examples for that, and especially now that we have kind of countdown, but before countdown, when especially starting out, doing missions and such would be the way to kind of farm up, and you would be quite often recommended to matchmake for some missions just so you get half carried. And people would go, oh, just run Fire Eclipse because it's really good and you can put it together really quickly. The thing is, though, that, for instance, something like Fire Eclipse is very reliant on game knowledge. If you know where everything is going to spawn, you can make that work much, much better than a player starting out that is trying to reactively do it after everybody has run out. And proactively playing or reactively playing is kind of the switch point once you in certain content, understand how it is done, and you can play proactively, that will kind of shift actually what builds can be recommended to you, basically. Because starting out, a glass red is definitely not a build I would just recommend right away. I would, for instance, yeah, as I do in the recommended build list, start with a striker, an obliterate striker, just to get things going. Because once you have built up a toolbox, you can start to shift from playing reactively in almost all of the content to going proactively. While playing proactively, you know where things are going to spawn. For instance, if you've done, legendary DUA dozens of times, you're doing it in a group setting, you kind of know where things are going to spawn. It isn't too long of a mission. After a while, you'll know, okay, it's this door, then that door, then this door. And by playing proactively, we can, especially in legendary, murder all of the things that, like the drone operators and grenade launcher guys and such, that are the mechanics of that mode, basically, and are the big dangers. By removing them, we quickly, and especially running a red build, so we can remove them quickly, we don't actually have to interact with the mechanics that much. We just murder them as quickly as possible. That's also what the foam eclipse usually is in there. For instance, with more experienced teams, it's usually a foam eclipse with 3 strikers, and just burning through the enemies faster than they can actually do their mechanics, as much as we can do. And because of that, we can actually play proactively. Once you also can play proactively, damage becomes a much more important factor. But that isn't the case starting out. But then also, of course, yeah, there's a subset of players that goes like, oh, a glass red, you can't survive anything with that. No, once you understand the game to a degree, it is actually just easier even to just kill the enemy faster than trying to out-survive them on the other hand. But that isn't the case starting out. When you're starting out, you won't have that game knowledge because you haven't done the mission 100 times. It's your first time going through. And that's one of the things here. I would love for recommendations to kind of be based on the player as well. It's not just a build. It's not a build that just does the thing. It is a build plus the player plus the content. All 3 of those factors matter. And then also it isn't that the build doesn't matter at all. Because as we all know, try running a gray build through legendary. You'll quite quickly understand why, yeah, gear matters. But then as well, yeah, it isn't just that the gear matters, because it needs to be tailored to the person asking the question, preferably, if you have that option. Because sometimes as well, you can't really, like, when a person just asks for a recommendation, you just want to give a simple one. You don't want to, go through a whole questionnaire with them. I understand. But in just kind of putting yourself in the mindset of what would a newer player see, because quite often you can guess if they are new or not, because depending on how they're asking the questions. And when they are asking for the best build, first of all, we all know there is no singular best build. But then as well, tailoring that answer to, for, in my experience, just for the lowest denominator, which is someone that is newer. And if they already have that, then we maybe go into somewhat builds that require a much larger toolbox. And to kind of showcase what I'm talking about, here we'll come to DUA, running an obliterate striker, kind of set up fully, but as well, kind of just to show some of the tactics. The thing here is, and the reason why this place gets used as much as it does, is that it is a place that is much more about knowledge than about execution. So when it comes to this area, there's a bunch of simple tricks. You will quite often see people take cover where I'm taking cover. You will see usually people using a decoy or such as their secondary tool. Or even, yeah, just alongside EMP sticky. Thing is that once you understand how to do this part, the build matters very little. I could do this with Umbra, I could do this with OD, I could do this with a purple build. Everything else would just likely take a little longer. Because this isn't about the build much, this is about knowing the tricks of the trade, basically. Knowing that a decoy can actually very easily distract all of these people knowing that I need to kill these last few very quickly in succession, knowing that they can't really see through this gate, and that I have enough damage to kill especially the drone ladies. But once we're kind of going, this is pretty easy. This isn't the build though. This is just an obliterate striker. Now, in my case, yeah, with Lexington, with grading there and stuff. All of that, only thing that it does is make it easier. It doesn't do the work for me, because the work here is especially in understanding that, for instance, yeah, when I have that decoy out, and that lead stinger is, of course, a very dangerous thing, that will turn a heavy. Once you know that, I can do that on any build, because the decoy isn't attached to it. Then as well, we'll have the heavy come around the corner, chain, break, dead. This part, and this is also why you will see this part over and over and over again, isn't about the build. This is only about what you know about the game and the toolbox that you've built up, because I could do this in any build. Also, as well, as often gets recommended, run just Striker. Well, we did with Obliterate Striker. Actually, for this fight, Obliterate Striker fits better. And that is that the person piloting it, not to like toot my own horn, but just to make that clear, is such an important factor there, together with the content. When I know where everything spawns, I'm not playing reactively. I'm playing proactively. I'm not going to sit in the back and let those people land from the chopper. I am going to push up. I know I can kill them quickly, so I can play proactively. That is the thing as well that usually separates people that understand why red builds have that power and people that don't. Because yeah, if you only play reactively, you don't get that. That's also kind of the thing. A long time ago, I made a video where the premise of it was you should die more. Which, of course, yeah, kind of in a humorous way, but in video games, you should die more. The more you're on the knife's edge, the more you're looking up the envelope of what the build can do, or yourself, the more you're gonna expand that envelope, basically. When you're pushing at the edges, yes, there is a hard edge, and sometimes you fall off of it, but quite often you just find out, oh, I can tiptoe a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. And when you do, it's pretty easy, for instance, to do this part. Now, this is, to be honest, my second take, of course, because on my first take, I lost track of where the yellow mini tank went, and it destroyed me, as it quite often can do in this part as well. But then on the second take, of course, we breeze kind of through it. Once you kind of know how to do this part, it's very easy. It's dependent on the build. You'll just go faster. That is also the thing then with the builds. The builds have basically a theoretical maximum. That's when we're talking about the DPSs and such. That's what we're basically talking about. They're theoretical maximums. While doing the shooty parts of it, now, of course, if I'm like doing, you know, busy little B stacks and then shooting myself, I can, of course, extract more. But even then, we can calculate those DPSs out. You can't exceed your DPS. The DPS is the theoretical maximum. So if you extract the most, you'll get close to it and maybe even at points extract the maximum DPS. But a build that has more DPS makes it easier, or well, especially if it's mechanically also easier, in the case of Striker, can make it easier than, for instance, if I was running a glass high-end red here, with which I could do this part as well. That would have a higher starting point, but it couldn't reach that top part. So for instance, at the end part, where I quickly kill the two heavies and kind of their support around them, I might have to hide a little bit more on that part. The build there, again, basically didn't matter. And that's kind of the point that I'm going for. Now, yeah, the build does matter for how much we can extract from it, but it isn't something that does anything by itself. Because the build by itself, if I ran in here and just went, you know, hands up, I'm just going to get shut up and be killed, of course. It is very easy to get lost in what a build is, together with, you know, what you can extract from it, and understanding that that isn't the case for everybody. And to kind of further illustrate that point, I'm gonna push up to here again. I'm gonna, for some reason, take cover on that same garbage can that everybody seems to take cover on. I wonder why. If you're actually wondering why, I don't know. This one is the center is actually pretty. Your enemies basically shoot towards your center. Your center is very covered here, very well covered on both sides, meaning that it makes it pretty easy to just sit here and just do one enemy at a time. Now that is, for instance, yeah, just pieing the room, as we kind of talked about, or talk about often with positioning. And the only real big difference here is just the speed at which things will happen. Because yeah, with that striker, I could very quickly push through here and, you know, we do more damage. So at the end of the day, getting through this mission, we have to do a certain amount of damage. The less seconds we need for that, and that's why DPS is that factor that we kind of go for that often. The less seconds we need to do that, the better. Because also, as long as the enemies are not dead, they can't shoot at us. Once they're dead, that's the end of the story for them. They can't, you know, they can't murder me if they're murdered already. And that is why, yeah, red builds do matter, and build does matter to a degree, but it isn't the only thing that matters. That's why, yeah, once you kind of actually understand how to, you know, play the game, doing stuff like this is actually not that hard. Here as well, we'll get the benefit of actually, for instance, being covered by fog, which actually makes it harder for the enemies to see us. Which I didn't plan for, of course, but it worked out. And the big danger is actually these UAV ladies. And I should have actually focused them down as they came from the chopper. I got distracted. But we'll finish in here. And yeah, as you can see, even this thing, which, yeah, again, is a red Patriot. There is enough damage here to do what I need to do here. We'll take the gate actually to get around. Where we'll likely struggle in a second is with the heavies, because yeah, they are very important for, or there it is very important how quickly we kill. I'm unsure where this other enemy is or what it is. It's gonna be a mini tank, I'm guessing. Oh, it's actually that mini tank and its owner, who's still alive. I'm gonna try to get one of these backpacks at least. And here, those heavies are not firing at me because they can't actually see me. I'm gonna actually decoy. I'm over there, boys. And yeah, I'm just gonna get some distance. The rolling was just for dramatic effect, of course. Here as well, Elma actually, yeah, as much as we go, you know, go for damage talents, especially here, it's actually kind of working out for me, as we see here. I'm actually at the knife's edge here, of course. Wait, I can chain that guy. And the big danger is this guy on the right now. And yeah, well, this kind of, yeah, devolves into a much bigger fight, because yeah, we can't get them at the very start when they're coming down the way that we did with Striker, because that of course is dependent on our DPS. It takes forever to kill those heavies. With this build, I still can. I can actually see about using this thing as bait. Let's see, we have one red, we have this purple. I'm hoping its engineer will come and repair it. But it didn't. we have a decoy still, so this fight is basically over. Oh, it's engineer. I don't know, it's engineer is alive. Well, this guy might kill me here. Of course, being the last guy. Of course, the last guy takes forever. There we go. Just to kind of show, yeah, a red Patriot. I should have actually used my LMG more. That would have likely been a much more powerful tool. Here, with the help of some fog, game knowledge on top, of course, you can... This part especially, that's the reason it gets used so much. It's not about the built dummy. It's about knowing the game. Now, the thing is, of course, then a big important part becomes teaching that game. And that's kind of where I feel a lot of people are lacking. Because I did this with this. Should I recommend this as the tool to do this with here? And then just wait for fog as well, as it helps out. And yeah, just also make it the third take, because that was actually the third take. So does that become the thing? Because here as well, it did take me longer, of course. The build matters. The vehicle I'm in matters. Because, yeah, we went from, you know, with the Striker being a sports car here to this being a bad station wagon. Let's say a very underpowered front-wheel drive station wagon for some reason. But it still got there. We went and did our groceries with it. The build, while it matters, it is not the only thing. And to also kind of expand on that point is the concept of fun, which gets thrown around so much that, to me, it's basically, at this point, a dirty word. But to me, the game is fun. The build that is ran is somewhat inconsequential to that. Whenever there are people that go, this build is fun, I actually just lose a little bit of respect for them, if I had any to begin with. As, again, the big game is fun, while the build can kind of influence how much enjoyment you can have in there. Because, for instance, there, I did enjoy it, as we had to kind of try hard to kind of make this build actually get through that fight. That was a challenge by the game, basically, a self-imposed challenge. Because, yeah, if I wanted to, I would much rather actually just run it with Striker and get stuff done. Because in a lot of things, it is going to actually matter that we get things done. And where fun kind of becomes an issue is not so much in if you want to run it for yourself, it's when you start recommending it to other people. Because if I recommend that red Patriot here as the build to go do DUA with, I would hopefully, rightfully, be ridiculed, as I should be, because of course it isn't. While I enjoyed my 3 minutes there, I wouldn't want to do the whole mission with that, as especially on later parts, it's just gonna suck way too much. It just doesn't have the firepower to quickly get through things, so it becomes a slog. Now that, again, can influence how fun the game is, but yeah, it isn't the fun of the build. Because I could do the same by just making a bad Striker and just, you know, maybe we just go all blue cores or something or such. Or don't take a weapon talent. We could impose those challenges upon ourselves if we wanted to, or just run it with a purple build or with a 511 build, which I have done as well. The thing there is that this whole, while there is a subset of players that are just meta, or just run this, usually that at least comes from a place of just, that is the best thing to recommend for people, because if they are at least with the highest end build, they're likely, even if they can't extract the maximum out of it, they will likely be able to just do the content as is needed. This Obliterate Red and Obliterate Striker, I'm pretty confident taking through any content in the game, including the raids, incursions, and everything like that, even though, for instance, on an incursion, you would much rather be on a chest Striker. we would slog our way through if all four player or well, all three players and the with a healer alongside, or the three reds were running this, would still get through, basically. That wouldn't, for instance, be the case if we were all running that red Patriot. First of all, it would be, it's a buffing build, so you would just want one of them. But there is a limit sometimes to how much you can extract from a build. And especially somebody who isn't as experienced will just not be able to extract to the same degree that somebody that is experienced on a build. And then there is, of course, the sidelines of where actually a skill needs to be kind of cultivated to a degree before it can be used. And I would say there's no better example for that one than a Regulus build. I feel, for instance, a lot of people, especially more recently, Headhunters, although of course Determined can make it a little easier, but Headhunter builds still require actually a lot of understanding of the game. Now, just aiming for the heads is by itself an acquired skill, but learning just the animations of enemies and how they kind of, weave and bob and weave and Jimmy and shimmy is very important. Here as well, knowing that, for instance, here, there's only 2 spawns, really, for these enemies. Meaning that I can try to capture them as they come in. But as well, I'm, for instance, not a great shot. That's why I actually do lean much more towards shooty builds than headhunty builds. I just don't enjoy these to the same degree. And while we're talking about the build somewhat being impactful to the fun, this is, for instance, to me, as far as that kind of thinking goes. As for me, I much more prefer to run a tech tank for this, even though we can't run the same amount of directives. But I just don't have the hand-eye coordination I myself used to, or would kind of need for this. That's why I end up getting myself, for instance, frustrated quite often by missing headshots. And while for some players, yeah, they kind of just see, oh, I can do this with this build, so everybody else should be able to. Especially with something like a headhunting build, it isn't the case. Now, of course, yeah, I could go with Harvest and with Determined. But then, yeah, we're kind of going into different land, of course. And nothing wrong with just using this, especially for farming purposes. But do consider always that some require a skill set. So, for instance, for headhunting builds, have the ability to kind of just pump out headshot after headshot is kind of required. That's why also, while I do consider this one of the strongest builds in the game, it's not per se my first recommended to new players. And lastly, I just want to talk about one last pet peeve that I quite often see and just wanted to give my take on. And that is that sometimes people go, oh, this is a chameleon build, or this is an Elmo build, or something like that. When, especially with most of the weapons, there are some exceptions. For instance, Capacitor comes to mind. Same, for instance, with Pestilence comes to mind, where sometimes you go with dedicated builds, but most of the times you don't need to. And honestly, the build doesn't matter to the weapon, or the weapon to the build. Quite often I see, for instance, yeah, with Strega coming up, or Chameleon, or things like that, or Eagle Bearer. What's a good build for an Eagle Bearer? Take a good build and put a good weapon on it. Now, for instance, I wouldn't per se call the Eagle Bearer or Strega good weapons, but you could definitely play around with them and try to see what they're all about. Chameleon, I would definitely consider one of the better weapons. And the build is not per se tied to the weapon for a lot of those. And to kind of go with it in that way, I feel it's kind of just, yeah, kind of giving the wrong impressions. Especially something, well, for instance, yeah, Strega doesn't interact well with Negotiator. The spread kills of Negotiator don't trigger Strega stacks, so you wouldn't per se want to maybe do that. So you need to know some of the exceptions. Those are handy to know. But overall, the weapon doesn't really care. What you do want to do is make sure that the crit chance and crit damage is actually set up correctly. So for instance, here I've specifically gone and actually made everything crit damage. So we're on 35, for instance, here. And well, most of the weapons now have been made so that the crit chance on them is basically 15 on almost all exotics, on a lot of them. There are some exceptions like this and the Bighorn, like the Strega and the Bighorn. And all you want to do really is get this as a general rule. If your crit damage is above the 120s, 110s even, you want to have this be a combined 60, but then combined especially with the Coyote here as well. I'm likely going to be using this mostly in mid-range, so I want to reach into the 50s. I'm generally, on this, I would likely put 3 crit chance mods on it, on the gear, because of course we can't put it on the weapon being an exotic. I would likely put 3 crit chance mods here for an 18 on it, so we would go to 53. And that will be perfectly fine for this. And the rest we would extract from the Coyote. Even if we're in the short range, we're still extracting quite a bit from the Coyote when we're just getting the crit damage. And that's kind of the way to go with that. Quite often, the build and the weapon don't interlink like that. But there is, of course, yeah, exceptions that make the rule. Which is, for instance, yeah, Pestilence build. There we do go for Langmo pieces to extract even more weapon damage from it because it lines up with the talent, of course. And if you're going, for instance, SMGs or something, this Fury makes sense with that. But to call some of these things chameleon builds and such, I feel is just a little bit too much. Or, you know, an Elmo build. Like, nah, this is Obliterate Striker with Elmo, but you could go any other weapon there. And quite often, yeah, the weapons are well worth kind of just messing around with and kind of knowing your way around. Even if, for instance, some weapons are considered more meta than others. And of course, I'm very much, yeah, kind of in the wrong camp to maybe say this, but try some stuff that isn't per se meta, even though, you know, I'm quite often the provider of discussing which weapons we should kind of go with. That information and that knowledge comes from actually running the weapons as well. And that's why I also do recommend actually playing around with all of the exotics, all of the weapons, even some of the lesser ones. I quite often have in some characters' inventories just to play around with them and see if maybe there is something overlooked with them. Because sometimes there is, but sometimes as well, in the case of the Overlord, it is actually just bad. Yeah, let's take it to a conclusion and to kind of round out this rambling talk. Okay, definitely one of the more rambly ones. But I wanted to just kind of, yeah, get this off my chest. As quite often, yeah, I do see just recommendations going out and just talking about the build as if the build is completely separated from content, from players, from the person controlling it. To me, still, all of these are basically, yeah, they're kind of like cars. You can kind of see it like that. And sometimes, yeah, we do lean towards certain types of cars. Everybody loves a supercar here and there, something super fast. But sometimes, yeah, you just need the torque of a truck to kind of, you know, carry the big loads. And then as well, the driver matters just as much. I can't extract from an Hunter's Fury build the same thing that some of the speedrunners can. I won't do on it what the Toasty can on it. And that's completely fine as well. Understanding that and discussing it in those ways actually helps, because quite often people will try certain builds. And that's also why my builds showcases have always kind of predicated themselves on, I also talk about how to play them. Because in how to play them is a very, like, that is to me actually the more core part than actually what the build itself is. There are some builds that sometimes require certain tricks or certain things to know For instance, with Eclipse, there's a bunch of knowing the spawns and such, but also, just knowing that you can double tap to ignite the chem, for instance, which still, well, thousands of players don't know, as still pops up here and there of like, oh, you can do that? Yes, you can. And those kind of toolbox, those things in the toolbox are actually very important to certain builds. And some builds require less of a toolbox, and some builds require a much bigger toolbox before you can even really run them. And things like Headhunter's Fury with Regulus, you really need to have decent aim for it, but you also need that game knowledge of where things spawn quite often, where, especially if you're kind of speedrunning with it, that is actually the part that makes it easy, because if those enemies escape, once they're loose, it's actually not that great of a tool, because you would have killed them faster usually with a high-end red or with a striker red. So this is just to kind of remind people to think about when you recommend things or when you discuss things, to kind of actually discuss them in situ, in how they actually get used. And that also includes the player level, not their SHD level, but just how good of a player they are. And there is no shame in, not being there yet. The only shame that it really exists is if you have actually been playing for thousands of hours and you still don't know the basics. But even then, we all miss some basic stuff here and there. And, we need to then hopefully kind of figure that out, or help each other to figure that out. Also, I feel in discussing how, the tools needed for the trade, that will actually help players much more than just the build. Because here's a glass red, go just run it. That just doesn't work out well for 9 out of those 10 people. There is, of course, that 10th person that then really takes to it, is autodidact, will go and teach themselves how to play it. But we could also just share our toolboxes. And that's kind of one of the future videos we're going to go in. I'm going to go into discussing the toolbox, and then actually just sharing toolbox things. Basically, how to, for instance, as we had here, how to use the health gate, how to use certain skills to kind of keep yourself upright, how to spot certain enemy interactions, and for instance, when will they go into lobbing a grenade maybe towards your face, and when are they maybe gonna run away and do a cover to cover, and maybe you can destroy them in that time. There's a lot of things that kind of fit in there. Just discussing the builds by themselves, I feel completely lacks any semblance of actually being useful. So yeah, that was a little bit of a man yells at sky. Well, I'm gonna stop yelling at the sky and actually go and play this video game that I quite enjoy. I hope this video was at least a little bit informative, maybe put some new ideas into some people's heads, and I hope you can come back in the future for even more rambliness. In the future, we're going to go into that, a video about building your toolbox and kind of the basics of that, which is kind of an extension of the Improving Yourself series. Also, I want to do, of course, a refactor build showcase. That'll likely be 2 videos from now. As also, the next video is likely going to be actually talking about a bunch of, 2 tools, one bunch of tools that I've made for Division 1 in recent times, and we'll go over that as, a global event is coming up, so I'll be spending some time over there. I hope you join me for those, and as always, have a good night.